I want to take a few minutes to restate and perhaps even further explain our response to the ongoing COVID health mandates. Why would I do that? After all, does anyone really want to talk any more about COVID-19? Well, let me give you a few reasons. Number one, we have a number of folks with us now who were not attending when all of this began. Number two, churches around our county or city are functioning with various interpretations of the county health orders. And number three, people have asked if we are continuing to submit to the mask and health mandates. We want to help with an answer. So on behalf of the elders, let me share some thoughts with you to help guide your thinking on this matter. I think we all need to be reminded that many of the facts we are citing and the positions we are advocating or condemning are the result of information that we are accepting as true from a variety of sources that we choose to trust. Now, this isn't inherently wrong, but it does remind us that we are drawing strong conclusions about epidemiology, about statistical analysis, about constitutional law and federalism. These and other fields of study that may not be our forte. The added challenge and responsibility amid our mental COVID fatigue is to process all of this data biblically. Now, as churches have tried to do this, they have chosen one of four typical responses. Quietly comply. Number two, comply, but then pursue legal action. Number three, quietly disobey without drawing attention. And number four, defy the order and pursue legal action. Most churches have responded quietly, whether in compliance or non-compliance. And a few have taken legal action for those more egregious inconsistencies. But I think we are wise and right to assume, in the spirit of Christian love, that each church has come to its conclusion on purpose. As we have chosen to comply, believing that government should act to protect its people in a health crisis, believing that government has not targeted our local churches, believing that health orders are in a line of authority that is constitutionally legitimate, and believing, most importantly, that the weight of Scripture is on the side of submission to authority, and that those authorities need not be without flaw to merit our submission. Now, even as we seek to comply, it is also true that we agree with much of the criticism aimed at various levels of government, either for overstated cases or for overreaching policies. This criticism forces us to ask, does the Bible help us to know how to please God when we aren't pleased with our government authorities? For part of the answer, I direct you to our study on civil disobedience from July 12th. You can find that on the GBC YouTube channel. We're confident that Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 teach us to obey and honor our civil authorities. We are to do this, Peter says, for the Lord's sake. And then Peter adds that by doing good, we put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. You see, Peter didn't want Christians to be known as radical rebels against Rome. And that was an easy charge against them, since they refused to say Caesar is Lord and instead declared their allegiance by saying Jesus is Lord. So Peter was saying, listen, they already think you are bad citizens. So do good anytime you can to prove that Christians actually make the very best citizens. Somehow we need to take that truth from the early centuries of the church and apply it to these days that we live in. That by our obedience to civil government, we could put to silence the ignorance of foolish men that wrongly define what Christianity really is. In another text, Matthew 17, Jesus answers a question about paying the Jewish temple tax. While his answer is actually making a deeper point, his practical conclusion on the tax matter gives us some instruction regarding our response to government. Jesus says of the temple tax that in order not to give offense to them, the tax collectors and ultimately the priests, give it to them. The point is, we don't want to give offense to the governing authority unless it is gospel offense, the offense of God's authoritative truth. And please bear in mind, Jesus was instructing his followers to not offend and further to fund the religious system that he knew would soon falsely accuse him and unjustly condemn him to death. Well, let me head toward the finish line with two questions and a story. So maybe that finish line is a few laps away. One question that I hear often in various forms is, when is enough enough? If not in those exact words, in some way, this question needs to be answered. When is enough enough? And although this question is often asked in great frustration, this is actually one question that Christians can answer with great clarity. From our study last time in Acts chapter 4, 17 to 20, where the apostles are warned not to speak about Christ, and their answer is, we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. And then again in Acts chapter 5, verse 27 to 29, we must obey God rather than men. Together, these two texts give us the classic biblical definition of civil disobedience. If human government commands us to do something that God forbids, or if government forbids something that God commands, then we must disobey human government in order to obey God. You see, we know when we must biblically disobey. We know when enough is enough. We know the black and the white. It's the gray that we are dealing with in the meantime. I believe too many churches and Christians are working hard to explain the health mandates in such a way as to make it look like the issue is as clear as it was in Acts chapter 5. Now, certainly, our experience of gathered worship that we've grown accustomed to over the years has been compromised by the health mandates. But we are not convinced that the government is forbidding us to worship. The second question is, if you don't like what is going on, what are you doing about it? Or perhaps the better question is, what does the Constitution say you can do about it? I'm afraid too often the response of those who disagree with the health mandates has been to not comply. They just don't do what is ordered or mandated. But this doesn't fix the problem if indeed there is a problem. Flying under the radar doesn't mean that the radar goes away. And ultimately, non-recognition of authority is the very definition of anarchy. And I think we can all agree that we don't want that. So what is your plan to claim your First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. If you really believe something needs to change, then please exercise your right to try to change it. This is the gift of our citizenship as American citizens. Well, finally, a story. It's a story about a man who took his stand against a corrupt, antagonistic government that was intrusive and overreaching. He took his stand citing Scripture. And he called his fellow countrymen cowards for not being willing to stand up against government regulations and for putting Caesar in the place of God. And I should note there's been a lot of this bravado going around. You've likely heard or read the bold declarations such as, "The cowards comply," or "The courageous cast off the tyranny of masks." "Pansy pastors bow to Caesar." "Faithful congregations refuse government interference." But back to my story of the man with a cause, because it's a pre-COVID story. It's an old story, about 2,000 years old. It's the story of a man named Judas the Galilean in AD 6, who led a revolt against the census tax implemented by the Roman emperor. He's mentioned in Acts chapter 5, ironically, one of our key texts on civil disobedience. You remember in Acts 5, the apostles are imprisoned for preaching Christ. Miraculously, the angel frees them in the night, and the next morning, there they are preaching again, to the bewilderment and anger of the Jews. They are arrested again, and Peter gives that well-known line in verse 29, "We must obey God rather than men." Well, the Jews want to just kill them right there. But Gamaliel comes to their defense with the argument that if this work is of God, it will last. But if it isn't of God, it will fail like the others in the past. Verse 36 and 37, he says, "For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered." Well, that's our guy, Judas the Galilean, who, according to the record of the Jewish historian Josephus, rallied the patriots and called anyone else a coward who dared to pay the Roman tax, insisting that this put Caesar in the place of God. Well, fast forward 25 years from Judas the Galilean to Jesus of Nazareth. He is confronted by Pharisees with a question about that same old problem of Roman tax. They thought they could trap him by forcing him to answer in a way that would either disrespect Rome or disrespect the patriotism of the anti-tax Jewish crowd. And you know the answer that Jesus gave in Matthew 22. "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And so I ask you, was Judas the Galilean correct in saying that all who comply with paying the Roman tax were cowards who put Caesar in the place of God? Does that charge stick to the one who said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's"? As elders, we believe that the example and the words of Jesus continue both to anchor our position of compliance and to transcend all of our dislike and concern for the present circumstances. So what does compliance look like at a Sunday gathering for Grace Bible Church? Well, we will continue to comply with the mandates by wearing masks and social distancing ourselves for our gathered worship. Now, of course, the exceptions for medical reasons have always been allowed, but I want to be clear that any conscientious objection is not an acceptable reason for not wearing a mask if you come to gathered worship. Certainly, if wearing a mask is any hardship to you, we invite you to participate from home, but if you choose to come, please wear a mask. Now, our focus each Sunday is worship. It is not on policing health mandates. So instead, we are appealing to your conscience to recognize the decision of the elders for this local body, and then to exercise forbearance with others who have varying opinions on all things COVID. We also understand that we have a lot of families and friends who are already in each other's homes and lives and do not feel the need to be cautious with each other. But when we are around those who aren't in that close circle, as we are at a worship gathering, we must be considerate of all. Now, in time, we'll be working on a plan to resume the nursery and Sunday school classes in all the safe ways that that'll be possible. But for now, let's get through these holidays with an added bit of caution. And while I'm sure you are longing to return to what we think of as normal, please do not make the mistake of believing that these months have somehow been wasted. Proverbs 19:21 reminds us that many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that stands. Warm regards to you and your family at this Thanksgiving season. Some of you we haven't been able to see for a good long while. And now, because we need it, and because of the promise of our faithful God to give it, grace and peace to you all.